At first glance, he was just another guy on set, a stuntman blending into the chaos of cameras, props, and rehearsals. Nobody looked twice at him. The bikers. They sure didn't. But they should have. The set was alive with noise and movement. Directors barked orders, assistants scrambled to adjust lights, and actors rehearsed their lines. The sound of engines revving in the background added an extra layer of tension to the scene. It was just another day on a film set that demanded precision, coordination, and a little bit of luck. Jack, however, moved through it all without a fuss. He wasn't the type to demand attention. In fact, most of the crew only knew him as the quiet guy who always got the job done. He didn't wear flashy clothes or carry himself like a big shot. His wardrobe was as plain as his demeanor, a simple black jacket, jeans, and sturdy boots that looked like they'd been through their share of scrapes. But there was something about Jack if you paid attention long enough. A calmness. A steadiness. It was the kind of presence that didn't shout for attention but made you notice anyway, even if you couldn't quite put your finger on why. The crew called him Jack. Just Jack. No one asked for his last name, no one needed to. Jack was the kind of guy who didn't offer more information than was necessary, and people respected that. Or at least, most people did. He wasn't flashy, didn't boast about his stunts, and didn't spend time trying to impress anyone. He was there to do his job and let the actors take the spotlight. The only time he stood out was when the cameras rolled and his stunts brought gasps and cheers from the crew. Even then, when people clapped or shouted, that was insane. Jack would just smile, give a small nod, and walk off to prepare for the next scene. But Jack's history wasn't something you'd find on a resume. It wasn't something he talked about. And it wasn't ordinary. It was dangerous, explosive, and entirely unpredictable. Years before he set foot on this film set, Jack lived a life that would make most people's jaws drop. It wasn't the kind of life he bragged about because, to him, it wasn't glamorous. It was survival. It was experience. It was a world where every move mattered, and the wrong one could mean the end. But no one on set knew any of this. To them, he was just a guy who knew how to fall off a speeding car, jump through fire, or make a fight scene look real. Today, though, Jack's past wasn't staying in the shadows. It was about to come back in ways no one on that set could have imagined. The bikers were a last-minute addition to the film. The director wanted authenticity, and what better way to get it than hiring real bikers? These weren't trained actors or professionals who understood the etiquette of a film set. They were rough around the edges, loud, and full of attitude. The moment they arrived, you could feel the change in the air. Their bikes were monstrous machines, roaring beasts that made heads turn. The crew looked up from their tasks as the bikers rolled in, their engines growling like predators staking their claim. They parked their bikes in a messy line, kicked down their stands, and swaggered onto the set as if they owned the place. One of them, a burly guy with a beard that could hide a small animal, spotted Jack and smirked. "Hey, stunt guy," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. He tossed an empty soda can Jack's way. "Think you can keep up with real bikers?" The others laughed, their voices blending into the guttural rumble of their idling engines. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even look annoyed. He simply picked up the can, tossed it into a nearby trash bin, and went back to adjusting his bike for the next scene. But that wasn't the end of it. The bikers weren't the type to let a quiet response slide. They thrived on reactions, on proving they were tougher, louder, better. And to them, Jack was an easy target. Just some guy in a leather jacket, blending into the background. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Jack's calm wasn't weakness. It was control. The day unfolded like most film shoots, slow, chaotic, and full of stops and starts. The crew worked around the bikers, who seemed more interested in showing off than following instructions. They revved their engines during takes, performed wheelies when the cameras weren't rolling, and made snide comments whenever they thought someone wasn't looking. Jack noticed it all. He noticed the way they swaggered around, the way they treated the set like their playground, and the way they dismissed him with every glance. But he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He focused on his work, tuning his bike, adjusting his gear, and mentally preparing for the stunts ahead. It wasn't his first time dealing with guys like this. They were all the same: loud, brash, and overly confident. He'd encountered their type on the road, in bars, and in places far more dangerous than a film set. By midday, the tension was impossible to ignore. The bikers had taken over a corner of the set, their laughter and engine roars drowning out the director's voice. One of them, probably their leader, leaned against his bike, watching Jack with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't talk much, do you?" the leader called out, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The crew glanced over, some curious, some nervous. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Jack looked up, meeting the leader's gaze. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He just stared for a moment, then went back to his work. The leader's smirk faltered, but he didn't let it show. "Guess you're too busy pretending to be a biker," he added, his tone sharper now. "Let me know if you need lessons." The bikers laughed again, but this time, the crew didn't join in. There was something unsettling about the way Jack handled it, or didn't handle it. He wasn't angry, wasn't rattled. He was just still. And that stillness carried a weight no one could quite explain. As the day wore on, the bikers grew bolder. They interrupted scenes, rode their bikes too close to the crew, and ignored the director's increasingly frustrated instructions. Jack stayed on the sidelines, watching, waiting. He'd seen their type before. He knew how they operated, pushing boundaries, testing limits, feeding off reactions. But what they didn't realize was that Jack had already figured them out. He was just letting them dig their own graves. Because when the time came, Jack wouldn't just surprise them. He'd leave them stunned. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the set, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. The film crew had relocated to a vast, open area to shoot an intense motorcycle chase scene. Dust swirled in the air as crew members scrambled to prepare the equipment. The bikers remained at the edge of the set, leaning against their machines with smug grins, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Jack. Jack, as always, was quiet. He stood next to his bike, a well-worn but finely tuned machine built for precision, not flash. He ran his hand over the handlebars, checking every detail with the practiced eye of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. To anyone watching, it looked like he was just focused on his task. But inside, Jack was taking mental notes, cataloging every action and word of the bikers. The leader, the same burly man who had thrown the soda can earlier, strolled over to Jack with an exaggerated swagger. His boots crunched against the gravel as he stopped just a few feet away. "Nice bike," the leader said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He gave a mock whistle and looked back at his crew, who chuckled in unison. "Looks like it belongs in a museum." Jack didn't look up. He tightened a bolt on his handlebars and calmly replied, "It gets the job done." The leader tilted his head, clearly irritated by Jack's lack of reaction. "You know, we're the real deal," he said, gesturing to his group of bikers. "Been riding for years. Not like you movie people, playing pretend. You ever even been in a real race? Or is falling off bikes your only skill?" The other bikers burst into laughter, their voices carrying across the set. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. The director, busy with the next shot, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. Jack finally stood upright, turning to face the leader. His expression was calm, unreadable. "Riding isn't about showing off," he said evenly. "It's about control." The leader's grin faded, replaced by a scowl. "Control, huh? Let's see how much control you've got when we're out on that track." Before Jack could respond, the assistant director called for everyone to gather. The next scene was about to be filmed, and it was a big one, a high-speed chase involving sharp turns, near misses, and a dramatic stunt that would end with one of the bikers skidding to a stop just inches from a cliff's edge. The bikers sauntered toward the set, their confidence on full display. Jack followed at a distance, his demeanor unchanged. As the crew gave final instructions, the bikers huddled together, whispering and laughing. Every so often, one of them would glance at Jack, their smirks growing wider. The chase began smoothly. The bikers roared across the dusty track, their tires kicking up clouds of dirt as they maneuvered through the obstacles. Jack, riding last in the formation, executed each move flawlessly, his bike gliding over the terrain like it was an extension of his body. But the bikers weren't interested in sticking to the script. During a tight turn, the leader suddenly veered off course, cutting sharply in front of Jack. The move was reckless, forcing Jack to brake hard to avoid a collision. The leader laughed, his voice echoing over the roar of the engines. "Keep up, stunt guy," he shouted, twisting his throttle and speeding ahead. The crew watching from the sidelines gasped. This wasn't part of the plan. The assistant director waved his hands frantically, shouting for the bikers to follow the script, but they ignored him. Another biker, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his arm, swerved dangerously close to Jack, nearly clipping his front wheel. Jack didn't flinch. He adjusted his grip and stayed on course, his expression calm but focused. The leader slowed down just enough to let Jack catch up, then turned his head and yelled, "This is how real bikers ride." With that, he popped a wheelie, the front tire of his bike rising high into the air. Jack remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He wasn't here to play their games. The chase continued, growing more chaotic with every passing second. The bikers ignored the markers and safety guidelines, tearing through the set like they owned it. The crew watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or let the scene play out. As the final stunt approached the dramatic skid near the cliff, the tension reached its peak. The leader, still showing off, revved his engine and sped toward the edge. The stunt was supposed to be Jack's, but the leader clearly had other plans. Jack tightened his grip on the handlebars. This wasn't about pride or ego. It was about safety, control, and sending a message. At the last second, Jack leaned forward, his bike surging ahead with a burst of speed that caught everyone off guard. The leader glanced over his shoulder, his smirk replaced by a look of surprise as Jack overtook him with ease. In a perfectly executed move, Jack performed the skid, his bike stopping mere inches from the cliff's edge. The crowd watching erupted into cheers, their earlier tension replaced by awe. The leader, unable to stop in time, veered off course, his bike skidding out of control. He tumbled to the ground, his bike coming to a stop a few feet away. Dust filled the air as the crew rushed to help him up. Jack dismounted his bike and removed his helmet, his calm expression unchanged. He walked over to the leader, who was brushing himself off and glaring at Jack with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "You okay?" Jack asked, his tone neutral. The leader didn't respond. He just scowled and stalked off toward his bike, muttering under his breath. The crew, finally recovering from the chaos, broke into applause. The director clapped Jack on the shoulder, grinning from ear to ear. "That was incredible," he said. "You saved the scene." Jack gave a small nod, his expression as unassuming as ever. "Just doing my job," he said. But for the bikers, the day was far from over. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The bikers rolled in late, their entrance like a storm on wheels. Engines roared, tires screeched, and the scent of burnt rubber filled the air. They came in a formation, their bikes gleaming under the midday sun. chrome, leather, and loud exhausts. It was all there, screaming for attention. Their arrival drowned out the steady hum of the film set. The director's shouts over the megaphone were no match for the growl of those engines. Crew members turned their heads, some annoyed, others curious. The bikers weren't just a group, they were a spectacle. "All right, let's move," the assistant director called, trying to regain order. But the bikers didn't seem to hear, or maybe they just didn't care. One of them stood out, a mountain of a man covered in tattoos, riding a custom chrome beast that glinted like a mirror. He cut the engine and swung off his bike, his boots landing heavily on the gravel. The crew gave him a wide berth as he strode toward the staging area. That's when his eyes landed on Jack. Jack was by his bike, a plain, sturdy machine that didn't shine like the bikers' rides but looked every bit as reliable. Jack had been fine-tuning his gear, his focus steady despite the chaos around him. "Hey, stunt guy," the big biker called out, his voice loud enough to make heads turn. He reached into his jacket, pulled out an empty soda can, and tossed it casually in Jack's direction. The can bounced once, skidded to a stop near Jack's boots. "Think you can keep up with real bikers?" the man added, his lips curling into a smirk. Behind him, the other bikers laughed. Their engines revved, the sound rumbling like thunder. Jack paused for a moment, then bent down, picked up the can, and tossed it into a nearby trash bin with a casual flick of his wrist. He didn't look at the biker, didn't say a word. Instead, he went back to adjusting his bike, his movements calm and precise. The biker's laughter died down, replaced by an awkward silence. The big man's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like Jack, a guy who looked too ordinary to stand out in a crowd. Jack's quietness wasn't a sign of weakness, though. It was something else entirely. The director walked over, waving his hands in an attempt to keep things moving. "All right, everyone. We're on a tight schedule. Let's get the scene set up." The bikers reluctantly backed off, but their eyes lingered on Jack. The big one, their leader, by the looks of it narrowed his eyes as if sizing him up. The day went on, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The bikers weren't interested in following directions. They loitered around, cracking jokes and revving their engines during takes. The crew's patience wore thin, but no one dared to confront them. Jack stayed in the background, watching everything. He noticed the way the bikers moved, the way they talked. They weren't just there to ride, they were there to assert dominance, to be noticed. The leader, whose name the crew had learned was Hawk, wasn't subtle about his disdain for the film crew or for Jack. Anytime he passed by, he'd make some snide comment loud enough for everyone to hear. "Careful with that bike, stunt guy. Wouldn't want it to fall apart on you. You sure you know what you're doing? This ain't some kiddie ride. Man, these movie people really don't know what a real biker looks like." Jack didn't respond to any of it. He didn't need to. The other bikers followed Hawk's lead, throwing their own taunts and jabs. One of them, a wiry guy with a snake tattoo running up his arm, deliberately brushed past Jack, knocking into him just enough to make a point. "Oops," Snake said with a mock grin. "Didn't see you there." Jack didn't react. He adjusted his footing and kept his attention on his work. The crew started to notice the tension, and whispers spread quickly. "What's their deal with Jack?" someone asked. "I don't know," another replied. "But he's handling it better than I would." By midday, the bikers had claimed a corner of the set as their own. They leaned against their bikes, smoking and laughing, their voices carrying over the clatter of the crew's work. Hawk sat in the middle, his leather jacket unzipped to reveal a chest full of ink designs. His eyes kept darting toward Jack, as if waiting for him to crack. Jack, however, didn't crack. When it was time for the next scene, a high-speed chase featuring both the stunt team and the bikers, the tension finally reached its breaking point. The assistant director gathered everyone around, explaining the sequence in detail. All right, this is a coordinated shot. Everyone needs to follow the markers. Safety is the priority. If anyone deviates from the plan, we'll have to reset. The bikers exchanged glances, smirking as if they just heard a challenge instead of instructions. Hawk raised a hand lazily. Yeah, we get it. Stay in the lines. Play it safe. Got it? The assistant director frowned but chose not to press the issue. The chase began with the roar of engines. Dust filled the air as the bikers sped off, their machines tearing across the open terrain. Jack followed behind, his movements calculated and precise. From the start, it was clear the bikers had no intention of sticking to the plan. Hawk and Snake broke formation, cutting across the markers and forcing the other riders to swerve. Jack stayed on course, his focus unshaken. He didn't try to outdo them. He didn't react to their antics. He just rode with the kind of skill that didn't need to be flaunted. That only seemed to provoke them further. At one point, Snake swerved dangerously close to Jack, his bike's rear wheel kicking up a spray of gravel that pelted Jack's helmet. Snake laughed as he sped ahead. Hawk, riding up alongside Jack, shouted over the roar of the engines. Come on, stunt guy. Show us what you've got. Jack didn't respond. As the chase continued, the bikers grew more reckless. They ignored the markers entirely, tearing through the set with wild abandon. The crew watching from the sidelines held their breath, unsure whether to be impressed or horrified. Then came the final stretch, a narrow path leading to a dramatic jump. The stunt was supposed to be Jack's, but Hawk had other plans. He revved his engine, surging ahead to take the lead. This one's mine, he shouted. Jack watched as Hawk sped toward the ramp, his bike roaring like a thunderstorm. But Hawk didn't notice the loose gravel at the base of the jump, a hazard that could throw off even the most experienced rider. Jack saw it immediately. He adjusted his speed, his instincts kicking in. The crew watched in stunned silence as Jack overtook Hawk in a seamless burst of speed. He hit the ramp perfectly, his bike soaring through the air in a flawless arc. Hawk, caught off guard, hit the loose gravel and skidded wildly. His bike veered off course, and he barely managed to avoid a crash. When Jack landed on the other side, the crew erupted into cheers. Hawk, meanwhile, sat on his stalled bike, his face a mix of fury and humiliation. Jack pulled off his helmet, his calm expression unchanged. He looked back at Hawk, his voice steady. Riding isn't about showing off. It's about control. Hawk said nothing. For the first time that day, he had no comeback. But the tension wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Hawk's humiliation hung in the air like a storm cloud. His crew muttered amongst themselves, their laughter and cocky attitudes replaced by silence. Hawk's bike idled on the gravel, but he didn't move. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the handlebars. Jack didn't wait for any reaction. He rode back toward the crew, parking his bike with the same unbothered precision he'd shown all day. The cheering crew gathered around him, some clapping him on the back, others just staring in admiration. That was insane, Jack, one of the younger stuntmen said, shaking his head. You nailed it? Jack simply nodded. Just doing my part. Hawk finally restarted his engine, his bike rumbling angrily as he rolled back to where his gang waited. His glare bore into Jack, but Jack didn't so much as glance in his direction. Boss. Snake said, stepping forward. You good? Hawk didn't answer. Instead, he slid off his bike, tossed his helmet onto the seat, and marched toward the crew. His steps were heavy, deliberate. The crowd parted as Hawk approached, his towering figure casting a shadow over everyone around him. He stopped a few feet from Jack, arms crossed, his voice low and menacing. All right, stunt guy, Hawk growled. You think you're hot stuff now? Think you can just show me up like that? Jack turned slowly, meeting Hawk's glare with a calm, steady gaze. His voice was even, almost soft. I wasn't trying to show you up. I was doing my job. Hawk took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Your job? Your job is to stay out of my way. The assistant director rushed over, sensing the escalating tension. Gentlemen, let's keep it professional. We've got a schedule to keep, and we don't want any. Hawk held up a hand, cutting him off. Stay out of this, he snapped, his eyes never leaving Jack. The assistant director hesitated, then backed off, glancing nervously between the two men. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his expression unchanging. You were off course. That jump wasn't safe. Hawk's laughter was harsh and mocking. Safe? You think I care about safe? I've been riding since before you could walk, stunt guy. Don't you dare try to tell me how to handle my bike. Jack tilted his head slightly, his tone still calm. Then act like it. A real rider knows when to respect the road and the people around him. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked ready to step in, while others seemed too afraid to intervene. Hawk's nostrils flared, his fists tightening. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, his voice dangerously low. But let me make one thing clear, you don't mess with me. Not here, not anywhere. Jack didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. I'm not here to mess with anyone. But if you keep pushing, you might find out what happens when you cross the line. Hawk's face darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might swing at Jack right then and there. But something in Jack's eyes stopped him, a quiet intensity, a calm confidence that spoke volumes without needing words. The standoff ended as abruptly as it began. Hawk turned sharply, storming back to his bike. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jack to hear. The bikers followed their leader, their expressions a mix of anger and uncertainty. They'd never seen Hawk back down from anyone before, let alone a quiet stuntman who seemed more at home in the background than in the spotlight. As they rode off, the crew let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Jack, the assistant director said, stepping forward. I don't know what's going on between you and those guys, but, just be careful, all right? They don't seem like the kind of people who let things go easily. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll handle it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the tension lingered. The bikers kept their distance, their glances toward Jack filled with a mix of anger and curiosity. Hawk, in particular, seemed deep in thought, his mind churning with plans that no one else could guess. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the crew began packing up for the day, Jack lingered by his bike, inspecting the engine with the same quiet focus he'd shown all day. You're a hard guy to figure out, Jack, one of the crew members said, approaching him. Most people would have lost their cool with Hawk. But you just stayed calm. Jack glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Getting angry doesn't solve anything. Staying in control does. The crew member nodded, though he still seemed puzzled. You ever ride with a group like that before? Jack's smile faded slightly, and his gaze drifted toward the horizon. Something like that. Before the crew member could press further, a loud rumble echoed in the distance. Heads turned toward the sound engines, unmistakable and growing louder by the second. The bikers were back. This time, they weren't alone. A second group of riders emerged from the shadows, their bikes just as loud, their presence just as menacing. Together, the two groups formed a line, blocking the exit from the set. The crew froze, tension crackling in the air like static. Hawk dismounted his bike, his smirk back in full force. Hope you're not in a hurry, stunt guy, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've got some unfinished business." Jack straightened, his movements slow and deliberate. He set his tools aside and stepped forward, his calm demeanor unchanged. "What do you want, Hawk?" he asked, his voice steady. Hawk spread his arms wide, his grin widening. "Oh, nothing much. Just a little, friendly competition. You and me, one-on-one. Let's see if you're as good as you think you are." Jack's gaze flicked to the other bikers, then back to Hawk. "And if I say no?" Hawk's grin turned cold. "Then we'll make sure you regret it." The crew exchanged worried glances, some edging closer to their vehicles as if considering an escape. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. If anything, he seemed ready. "All right," he said finally, his voice calm. "Let's settle this.